Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
All right, listeners, we are back on a heck of a run for guests. We had Ben Freeman from CIP talking think tank, foreign funding. You know, we've had just about everything from scholar to military officer to, you know, kind of random ice cream man, and related to the minister of ice cream and me and the new Eisenhower project we've been talking about is, of course, Kwiatkowski, who is one of our, you know, senior fellows. We're basically right around 12 apostles at this point. And, you know, we were really happy to bring her on board. In fact, Colleen Rowley, our kind of mutual friend, had said at one point, how do you not have Karen on this team? And I said, oh, man, like I really need to. And I had first, I think, like many Americans in some cases, I think, first seen her on, you know, the Why We Fight documentary, which I had watched after the Iraq surge, which I think was not the intent of the filmmakers, but it's when I sort of really got into the critical side of the war. So I was, of course, like, yes, let's reach out to her. So just for basic background, for those who don't know, Karen is a retired U.S. Air Force officer. She retired in 2003 after 20 years in uniform. She had a variety of assignments, but they included Pentagon desk officer and various roles related to the National Security Agency. After retiring, she became a noted critic of the U.S. involvement in Iraq, but she was particularly known for her kind of, you know, essays and whistleblowing surrounding failures of intelligence, the politicization of the Iraq War, and just everything leading up to that sort of grotesque moment that we were all living through in 2001, 2, and 3. After that, she's, you know, been writing for Lou Rockwell and lots of other locations for a long time. She ran in the Republican primary for the U.S. House of Representatives in Virginia. And one of the things we're going to talk about is, you know, because I like to geek out on this stuff, as Henry knows, you know, she worked on Africa, on sub-Saharan Africa, both in uniform and then also in scholarship, you know, writing books on the subject. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And just she's done a whole lot, both in the 17 years since leaving uniform and the 20 years within uniform. I mean, you could almost argue that what we're talking about is two full military length careers in very different ways, or in very different ways of doing it. So she has a master's from Harvard, from the University of Alaska. You know, her thesis was on Angola and the Reagan Doctrine, which we're going to talk about. And she was a founding member of the Veteran Professionals for Sanity, which has some similarities to the project here at the Eisenhower Media Network. So now that I've laid out way too much flattery, Karen, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. And you know, it when you go through all those things, it is a lot. It is a lot of things, but you know, that's part of what we do. I mean, people that go into the military tend to be people that think about what is their role in the bigger picture. In fact, I think that's a recruiting. I think that's one of their recruiting mechanisms. You know,
Right.
Joint. You know, you've got an impact to make. So, you know, so I think in the military, you know, of course, the first half of my 20-year career was during the Cold War, and that was things seemed maybe I was young, but things seemed simpler then. It wasn't hard to hate communists. It wasn't hard to, it wasn't even hard to believe the CIA and U.S. intelligence about Russia at that time, even though in retrospect, we know that a lot of that intelligence was almost as politicized as what came later, and what continues to occur. But those first 10 years were very simple. And I know that, of course, I was always interested in foreign policy and things like that. And I was working on my master's degree. So I was reading and trying to understand. And I remember, I guess it was right at the time that the wall fell. And I was taking a class on Eastern European countries, or I forget the name of the course, but it was studying the satellite, the Warsaw Pact countries. And we had to predict of all of these countries, which one would be free first and separate from the Soviet Union, which would be free at the last. And I remember my expectation was 100% wrong. It sticks with me. I felt that those countries that had been most oppressed, most repressed, like Romania, would be so mad, they had it up to here, that they would be the ones. And of course, that's not the case at all. And it's never the case. It was the Polands, the Czechoslovakias, the most free in a sense, the most with access to free information, those with more access to ideas, more access to organization, more access to communication beyond just their own country. Those are the ones that got their freedom first. And of course, it wasn't given to any of them. They took it. And I think that's, we're very fortunate in this country. We haven't had to take our freedom. We take it for granted is what we do. But anyway, I remember I was so wrong. So I was always interested in looking at how things happen, how things change. And then my second half, so the wall fell. Soviet Union shortly thereafter came apart. And the Warsaw Pact was one of the first things that collapsed. And I thought, well, this will be the end of NATO, because, of course, NATO had grown up as a pure response to the Warsaw Pact organization. And, of course, that was not what it did. NATO began to expand, looking for new members. And I said, well, that's not what I expected. But, of course, I should have expected it, because how NATO responded to a changed environment, which was to shift their focus in order to keep their funding coming, no matter what the cost and how silly it might be. That's actually the rule. That's actually how it works. So, I had a couple of awakenings in those early 10 years. And then the second half of my career, of course, that's when I got into military affairs, that kind of thing, foreign military affairs, and working at the Pentagon, of course. And, of course, my last 3 years was up at OSD, and that's where I was exposed to our Africa policy, which of course we can definitely talk about. We should talk about that. And then of course looking at how the Iraq war was coming down. And I was in the Pentagon on 9/11, and that was kind of the kickoff, really the kickoff for what we did in Iraq. Because you remember even the very day it happened, they were how can we tag this? How can we put this on Saddam Hussein? Because they wanted to go in so badly for the second Iraq war. But anyway, I'm sorry, I've talked too long.
Right. No, yeah. Like sweep it up, right? Related and not
exactly.
On the snowflake.
Yep.
So if I could back up briefly, there's two things that struck me about your background, and I'm big on connections and timing, and I read into things too much as a rule. But and then some of the things you said. So the first thing is, you entered active duty, I believe, in 1983. Is that correct?
Yep, early 83.
So I guess I'm interested in kind of backing up to, a little bit of your sort of youth, personal decisions to join. Keeping in mind that while everything's not about gender and identity politics, as I know, and get myself in trouble for saying, this was the time only 3 years, for example, after the first, females are graduating from West Point. So this is like an interesting time to be joining the military. And so maybe we'll start there. And then I've got a question about the phases of your military as well, your career, that is.
Yeah, well, what I did when, my dad was in the Navy for 4 years, and he used to tell us great stories about those 4 years. And his brothers, I mean, he would come from a family where a good many of them served in the military. And I had cousins, I had much older cousins who were in Vietnam, and they did it out of patriotism. You know, it was like maybe misplaced, but I mean that, you know, this was kind of our culture. I mean, I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, but my folks are from Southern Ohio. So it's still part of that hillbilly elegy type countryside, you know, that Appalachian part of the United States. But anyway, so I think, well, I have 2 younger brothers, and we all went in the military. And I also needed money to go to college. So I applied for various scholarships, and I got an Air Force ROTC scholarship in high school. So, you know, that kind of clinched the deal. And, but yes, I think I applied to, I don't know which, I think I applied to one of the academies. I can't remember which one it was. I didn't get in. I didn't get I didn't understand the process of getting with your congressman, but still very interested in college in general and not having to pay for it because I didn't have the money to pay for it, and also interested in serving in the military. And I guess I was probably a tomboy because I know in college, I skydived, and I did all kinds of things like that. So I was probably one of those people that is looking for experiences kind of thing, physical challenges. And anyway, so the Air Force gave me a scholarship, and so I went in the Air Force. And I don't know, I don't have a lot of relatives in the Air Force. Most of them were Navy and Army, but that's how I got in.
Right. And then what's interesting about your career, as I was just kind of looking at the years, I mean, one could argue that essentially you were part of 3 distinct phases in, the American military experience of the modern era. So like your first 8 years is, end of the Cold War, but you're coming in during, like Able Archer, the kind of heightening of the Cold War, the next wave under early Reagan years. Then you've got like the triumphalist 90s, Clinton years, post-wall coming down, America can do anything, right? The unipolar moment. And then at the tail end, it's kind of the 9/11 and response. And so, having gone through those 3 phases, were there institutional changes that you saw? Were there policy changes that you saw at the time, or maybe even more so in retrospect in those different phases?
That's a good question. And it's I don't know for sure. I know I learned more as every year passed. I'm learning how it works and kind of how policies are made. And I'll tell you a couple things that, and maybe this is something we want to talk about later, but why I kind of became a critic of a lot of what I was seeing, just as far as that institution of the DOD, and of course the Congress that, the government that has such adventurous DOD, which we've had for all that time. So in the Reagan times, remember the Iran-Contra thing, right? And you remember the Marine that was up there in his uniform testifying that he was glad that he participated. Ollie North, right? And there were a great many. I would say Reagan supporter type people. And of course, I was a supporter of Reagan also, but a lot of people in the Christian Coalition, other conservatives, communist hating type folks, which I'm part of that, I guess, at the time. But a lot of them felt that Ollie North was a hero. And I know at that time, my younger brother was in the Marines. And so I remember talking to him. I think I was stationed in Alaska at the time, toward the end of that tour. And I remember talking to him on the phone, and I said, "Hey, how about that Ollie North? He's a Marine like you." And my brother's response was very, it was opposite of what I thought it would be. He was like, "No, we're not proud of this guy. This is not what Marines are about. We follow the rules. We don't do policy. We don't pursue policy for our own political agenda." Anyway. He didn't talk in those terms, but that was the impression that I got. So, so I got to see the Iran-Contra and how kind of, for someone who is in the military and is kind of proud of the country, you see that and you learn more about it. And of course, we're still learning a little bit more about it. It kind of shakes your confidence, and you realize there's something else going on here. What is this institution capable of if this is what can happen and does happen with the involvement of so many folks, politicians, political appointees, and members of the military. How does this all work? So kind of a little bit eye-opening. You mentioned Clinton, of course, and I was in the Pentagon on the air staff when Clinton was going through his impeachment process. And early on in that impeachment process, he launched missiles at Baghdad and some other places in Iraq and blew up something. I forget what it was. And we called them the Monica missiles. I'm not sure we weren't the only ones that called them that, but, it was a military response to a domestic political embarrassment of some sort. How does the president show that he's, a tough guy, or, how does he make his critics happy or whatever? He bombs a country. And, it's kind of funny. And I sat with the guy I worked with at that time was a fighter pilot on his air staff tour. And he was the kind of guy that, he wished he was back in the cockpit. Most pilots are like that. They prefer to fly. And this guy was like that, but he's really, really wise and smart. And they did target. They worked on targeting with other parts of the air staff. And about, a couple years before 9/11, I was talking about, how are you targeting? He goes, well, it's really, we've bombed everything we can possibly bomb about 10 times. So we just kind of go through and, redo it. I mean, but the futility and the idiocy, the expense, the cost, the waste, all of this, this fighter pilot who would prefer to be in an airplane dropping these bombs. He didn't really care how stupid it was if he was dropping them, because that's kind of what his job was. But when he's back in the planning side, it's like, God, this is so insane. And it's kind of like, of course, I had read, as we all have, I'm sure, Catch-22, but took place in a different era. But I think the fundamentals are largely the same. So I guess you could say I got more cynical over time. As I learned more about the institutions that I was a part of, my cynicism increased. What were these institutions really about? And I think they were about what all bureaucracies are about, which is growing your budget and growing your importance relative to other competitors for that budget. So that's, pretty simple. Defense doesn't really come into it. And of course, I think it's clear our government, our military in the United States today and for some time has not done defense. The very fact that I'm sitting in the Pentagon that's being attacked on 9/11, probably what we would consider the most secure location on the planet, not defended there. That kind of sealed the deal for me. This our government doesn't, our Pentagon doesn't do defense. But it took me a long time to get to that point. Took many years of trying to be hopeful. Well, maybe this is just an aberration, to finally understanding how it really works.
So, Karen, you and I actually were at the Pentagon at the same time, very briefly. Shortly after I joined up, in February 2003, my MP company got sent to the Pentagon to do security.
Oh, cool.
And around that time, or I think we got there like on the 22nd of February. It was just before this huge snowstorm that just covered D.C. But I ended up spending 5 months doing guard shifts near the construction site where the plane hit the building. You could say that much of my early time in the Army was both figuratively and literally shaped by 9/11. I'm curious, could you give us a quick breakdown of your time at the Pentagon and how some of those experiences drove you to a new understanding about neocons and the political nature of foreign policy more generally, such as being told to say nothing positive about the Palestinians? And what was the environment there as far as personnel and atmosphere, both before 9/11 and in the lead up to you becoming a whistleblower over Iraq?
Well, I went to the Pentagon initially in the spring of 1998, and I had been at NSA. I was right up the street, up the road at Fort Meade. So took a Pentagon tour at the air staff, and we were operational plans. So, and I think I worked what area I worked. Well, it was Mid-East. But I forget my sub area. But that group of folks had people from all different backgrounds. We were all political military affairs people. That was our new assignment number, but they came from different places. We had logistics people. I was a communications person. That was my background initially. I spent 15 years doing comm electronic type stuff. So I was that. We had pilots, we had navigators, all kinds of folks like that in the air stuff. It was a great group of people to work with. I learned a lot about kind of the whole way the Air Force works. And of course, they were almost all, not all, but most of them, I think, were cynics because they had actually been around. I mean, these guys were in their 30s and 40s, and they'd spent a lot of time learning about the military. Of course, they were proud to be there, but a lot of them were cynical, and I gained a little bit of that. Then that tour lasted until I was there for 2.5 years, and I took a second tour, even though the first one wasn't really 3 full years. I curtailed that a little bit and moved over into another part of the Pentagon, and this was the Office of Secretary of Defense in plans for sub-Saharan Africa. So that was where I worked next. And with that group, I worked with a lot more civilians. So it was actually, and you guys probably maybe appreciate this, but, it was fun working with military people, especially when they've been all over and done lots of things, and they're kind of similar to you in age and attitude. There's that. When I moved to the OSD, of course, I worked with more of the career civilians and also, of course, appointees. For the first time, we got to understand what a political appointee was. I think they call them Class C. Although Trump's changed, he's got a new class of political appointees he just changed it recently. Anyway, these political appointees had come in with the Bush administration, and I'm not really I'm not working Mideast policy initially. I started out in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's when I wrote one of the books I wrote. I did work Africa in the air plan side on the air staff. I wrote one of those books, and I finished up the second one when I was in OSD working on the air staff. So working at sub-Saharan Africa. Anyway, it's kind of confusing, but those books related to Africa because that was my area. We finished those up, and I'm working and having a good time, not worrying about anything. And I got drafted, which was not my choice. But in the military course, whatever, I got told we need somebody to fill some positions over in Mideast, Near East South Asia, NISA, which was obviously Iraq, Saudi Arabia, North Africa, it's included. So I took the North Africa desk, and I did not want to go. And part of that was, this was 2000, early 2000. And of course, Bush had come in. I was not immune to what was going on in the news. And I was learning about neoconservatism. And of course, George W. Bush Jr., 43, I was never a fan of his father. Which kind of connects back to, this whole span of time. But here we have W coming in, and Cheney. And of course, not a fan of Cheney, I have to say. And he wouldn't have been a guy I would have supported, even though I was Republican. But I had read things and heard things, and we knew one of the reasons I didn't want to go over there to NISA is because of Bill Luty, his terrible reputation that he had as a politicized. Now, he's a retired Navy captain. By the way, Bill Luty, 17 years later, he's working at the National Security on a contract with the National Security staff of Trump. So we can only hope if Biden does actually go into office that Luty will be unemployed again, but I doubt it because Biden's bringing the neocons back. So whatever. But Luty, like a wart, you can't get rid of. I mean, he's there, and his reputation is terrible. In fact, one of the reasons that they were looking for people from the other offices was that he couldn't keep people. He wasn't able to. People were quitting. Why were they quitting? Well, I found that out after I got there. But we just, it was like a general bad situation. But they needed a warm body of a lieutenant colonel type warm body to work the North Africa desk. So I moved over there, and I did so. You can't say under duress because you're in the military, you just do it. But I mean, I was not a volunteer. And so as I'm looking around, I'm not like, oh, how great it is to be here. I'm looking around trying to be somewhat positive, but also basically my cynicism and my objectivism is getting is in control. So I'm looking at this stuff like, what's happening here. And I made a number of friends there who military types. I think there was an Army colonel and a Navy captain there, both who were working on getting out of there. They were working on curtailing their own OSD staff tour, which they needed. It was a ticket punching kind of thing for people that wanted to go on to commands or whatever. And why were they leaving? Well, they told me why they were leaving. And they said, well, these neocons. I said, what are these neocons? Actually, I've heard of this. What is this thing? What is this philosophy? And they explained it to me. And they, beyond that, talked about procedural aberrations and politicization of things that offended them. And also, like anybody, these guys wanted to have their voice heard, and they were being told, that's not what we want to hear, so you need to shut up. I mean, and that probably was how they were told that. And so they're frustrated. They're leaving. They're finding better jobs because most of these guys wanted to stay in, the full 26 or 30 years, whatever they could do. So this is how I get there. And I'm working North Africa. We're hot bunking. There's a lot of appointees coming in, people who had never been in the military, very ideological types that were being brought in. And in the summer, after I moved over there, because it was the spring of 2000. During that summer timeframe, they were beefing up the Near East South Asia shop. And in August, we had a meeting. I've written about this, whatever, but in August of that year, we had, I say 2000, I meant 2000 and 2002. So it was after 9/11. So in August, we have a big staff meeting because people are getting grumpy because they're like crammed together in this cubicle. And of course, the Pentagon is like that. It keeps growing and growing, and they've made offices out of hallways. They've done everything they can to cram people in there. But it's a little bit tight, and people don't know each other, so there's frustration. And so we have a meeting in August, and Bill Ludi says it's a NISA meeting, and he says, "Hey guys, I know it's been crowded. We've got some new space, and a lot of these new people will be part of Office of Special Plans, and they're going to move in the next several weeks over there. But I don't want you to say anything about the name of this Office of Special Plans. It's kind of like," and this is where it gets hokey, because you can sit there and tell people, you're telling 25 or 30 people in the Pentagon, Office of Special Plans. It's very nondescript. But then he says, "Oh, but it's a secret." That's kind of like cartoonish, really. But anyway, that's what he says. So we don't want to say anything about it. But really, it's going to work the Iran stuff, Iraq and Iran. Of course, Iran wasn't even, they'd switched from Bush had shifted forces into Iraq, or moved emphasis into Iraq from Afghanistan. And Iran wasn't even on obviously the neocons don't like Iran, but that wasn't on our operational plan. But that's what this Office of Special Plans was going to do. So anyway, they talk about that, and eventually the guys did move out into the Office of Special Plans. But we still, as NISA, our staff officers in NISA, interfaced with them all the time. And one of the things we were told in this meeting is, he said, once they're set up, Office of Special Plans will produce talking points on terrorism, on WMD, on Iraq, on Iran. And these talking points will evolve. And whenever you send a paper up, because of course where we worked we're staff officers, what do? We write papers on our area of expertise. We research it. We use the intelligence that's available to us, and we put together position papers. That's what you do. You push papers up the chain, and it keeps going up the chain to inform whoever needs to be informed. And he said, when you write these papers, from now on, you won't do any of the intelligence summaries or recommendations. We will give you what goes in each of these papers. And so when you have a paper that you're doing a staff position paper, whatever it is, you contact Office of Special Plans, and they're going to give you what goes in there. And you copy and paste. You do not change. You do not, modify. You do not delete. You do not cherry pick any of that. You take the whole thing in your paper. And it was several pages. You'd have a 2-page paper with 3 pages of stuff from OSD that would be shoved up the chain. That was one of the direct orders. So you think about that, if I'm making McDonald's hamburgers, that might work, having a standardized way of doing business and compartmentalizing it. But what we were doing, it was kind of, was very propagandistic. And of course, people said that, not just me, all of us working. We would look at these things we were given, and then we'd see how they changed. And over the autumn of that year, they would change. Some of the talking points that they had were the same things. Oh, and these talking points were secret, at the secret level, at least. We didn't do I didn't do TS papers, but they were definitely at secret level. But there were a couple of strange things about them. One is the pages would be classified, but not the paragraphs or the sentences, which of course violates the rules on how you do classification. Every statement, every paragraph has to be separately classified. And they refused to do that. In fact, one of the Army colonels was so I'm not even sure if that wasn't the main reason he got out of there. He was so upset about them not following the rules. And he went up the chain to say, you can't do it like this. And they just told him to shut up. We're doing it like this. Because these are civilians. These are political appointees. They don't have, it wasn't just that they didn't have the training. They had no respect for the process either, because, and what we didn't know at the time, but it's because they had a job to do. And their job was very different than what all of us thought our job was. Anyway, we got to see how these things evolved. And for a long time, we had a talking point that we were required to use in this list of talking points that talked about the meeting in Prague between supposedly between one of Saddam Hussein's intel guys and one of the bombers, Mohammed Atta, I think. And then after the newspaper debunked it, the FBI actually had to be interviewed in the Times because Times was pretty much reporting all these talking points. That was the other thing that was very strange. The paragraphs weren't marked, and then we'd see the stuff in the newspaper. So like, what is that? That is so strange. But anyway, they stopped. They pulled it from the talking point. They pulled that talking point after it was debunked in the newspaper by the FBI. So we're sitting here almost like watching Peyton Place, a Peyton Place of government, with these little games that they're playing. And where was the truth in all this? Well, not very, hard to find the truth, really. Obviously, it dawned on most of us. And I was probably, I think there were some reporters and some people, critics outside of the Pentagon and some within the Pentagon who they understood sooner than I did what was really happening. But I came to understand it. And at the time that I did, that was also in about the autumn of 2002. And I began writing these little short essays for my friends. And they were very kind of like black humor, dark humor kind of things. And I'd said to my friends in different places at Pentagon, and they would all laugh and they go, yeah, it's funny. But it wasn't funny. It wasn't funny. It was like terrible funny. And so I felt like I needed to get a larger audience. And so I found David Hackworth's site, and I sent him 4 or 5 of these things that I had written. And they were based on things that would happen to me during the day, or meetings or things that were happening. I'd be like a kind of a sarcastic take on the neoconservative action of the day. And Hackworth, I did not know Hackworth. And you guys, you know Hackworth pretty well. I mean, he's passed, but he was very adamant about he did not want women in combat, which and he had his own opinions about a lot of things. Very tough guy, very principled guy. And I had no connection with him. I had no idea, but he immediately accepted and gave me a platform on his Soldiers for the Truth website immediately. And why would he do that? He didn't know me from Adam. What credibility could I possibly have other than, I have a .mil email address I used. I mean, he knew I was in the Pentagon, but it occurred to me months later that his contacts and all the people that I knew too, who wouldn't do anything but would talk every once in a while and make a complaint, that he knew he had tons of other evidence that corroborated the kinds of things I was seeing also. So he did that. And that was a great thing for me. It gave me kind of an outlet for my, I have to say, anger. And, later after it came out, I'm active duty at that time. And of course I would have been in big trouble. I didn't release classified information, not any more than the Times already had access to, certainly, because I would, I wasn't doing that. But yeah, disrespecting the Pentagon leadership and the neocons. It was not good. They don't look kindly on that. I don't know if it's changed much since then, but I would have gotten in big trouble. So I was published anonymously by Hackworth, and that gave me kind of an outlet to kind of record what I was seeing and what I was thinking and my assessment of it. So I don't know if that's whistleblowing, because it wasn't like classified information. I wasn't stealing documents or anything like that, but it enabled me to get up to my 20. It enabled me to stay in there and at least say, what's my purpose here? Well, maybe my purpose might be to witness what we're doing. And so that went on for about 8 or 9 months, and then I retired. Anyway, that's another long divergent thing. I don't even remember what the original question was, but that's kind of how I got there.
Oh no, you did. It was great. In terms of military intervention, how did you perceive what might have seemed to be a righteous choice to intervene militarily prior to 9/11, regardless of the place or purpose? And how do you see that type of intervention today?
Well, actually, during the NATO bombing and the actions in Yugoslavia, that was really where, because I did not agree with that, and I didn't. I was in Italy. I was serving in Aviano at that time, and I even had a 3-month tour. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I got the dog and the grandkid here. But I had a 3-month tour in Verona, which is one of the NATO bases, and worked with them. And so I got to see how NATO was operating. And of course, Aviano was flying raids or whatever, bombing different parts of Serbia and former Yugoslavia from the base that I was stationed at. And it was, and I worked for 16th Air Force headquarters at the time, so we're kind of getting an overview of all this. And it didn't make a huge amount of sense to me. And also, of course, Italy was suffering. We got not we in Aviano, but Italy did receive some refugee flow and some concerns of having this NATO prosecuted, U.S. prosecuted action right next door. It was just kind of, it's kind of disappointing. Like, is this what military, is this what we do? Is this what it's about? Because it was very different than what I had come into in the early 80s, So I was already predisposed to look askance at interventions, military interventions in general, because of what they're about, what they're fundamentally about, what the people are told they are about, the impacts that they have. A lot of this just didn't go into it. It's not like I'm a bleeding heart, but it just didn't make a lot of sense. Seemed like a big waste of resources. And certainly viewing from what I saw in Verona in my time there at the NATO base, NATO was, oh my God. I mean, it made me very glad I was in an American service branch rather than one of something. And I don't mean to criticize, but I have to criticize, because it was shocking the how things got done and the kinds of things that didn't get done. It was I was glad to be an American, but I wasn't glad to be involved in that activity. It didn't make a lot of sense. So I was predisposed to be cautious. And again, when Clinton did Yugoslavia, or when NATO did it, this was supposed to be the world's first humanitarian war. What kind of newspeak is that? What kind of Orwellian concept is that? A humanitarian war? It just, and again, I'm sure that's what we're doing in Somalia and South Sudan. And I don't know, maybe this is a thing that I missed the training class when they explained how that worked, but it didn't make a lot of sense. So with the Iraq thing, first off, Afghanistan, I didn't really get, because it wasn't the Taliban that did 9/11, but they were hosting this guy, and so whatever. I'm saying, oh, okay, fine. The Afghanistan thing you can do, but the Iraq thing, which they really wanted to do, and had been working on since shortly after 9/11. I mean, they're working on preparing the military to go into Iraq, and I'll tell you how historically we can read the newspaper and figure it out. But I ran into a guy. This was about January 2003. And it's a friend of mine. He was in the Navy. I think he was in the Navy or Army. Navy. And I had not seen him in 8 months. I hadn't seen him since May. And we're in the Pentagon, okay? There's 26,000 people there. You're not going to see everybody every day. But I used to work with this guy, and I used to see him around, and I hadn't seen him. So I said, hey, dude, I thought I didn't, hadn't seen you. What have you been up to? And he goes, I've been working 14 hours a day since May of last year, getting ready to invade Iraq. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, yeah. He goes, there's a lot of logistics involved in invading Iraq. And I'm saying, what? I said, I thought that they only just decided to do that just a little while ago. And he goes, oh, no. We've been working on this for 14 or 15 months. And I've been working on it myself since May, putting in, he was a dedicated guy. So he was working hard to make sure it happened. So this is, and this was long before the public propaganda campaign really got going in the States to kind of get the American people behind this thing. So basically it was going to happen. So we do these interventions because the Pentagon or politicians or ideological leaders want to do them. It has nothing to do with defense, offense, anything else. We want to do this. So we have this tool and we're going to do it. So I was predisposed to not be a fan of it. I'd seen it before. And of course, in 2001, 2, and the beginning of 3, when I was up there, same things happening again. I hate to sound so cynical, but I was, they made me a cynic. If you kept your eyes open, anybody up there would be a cynic, because it wasn't just me that saw this. It was tons of people. And I think one of your questions we may get to later is why more people don't speak out. And again, I didn't speak out with my name because I wanted to retire and I didn't want to go to Leavenworth. I have 4 children, a husband. I was the sole breadwinner. I had my own reasons for not wanting to go to jail. I'm sure most people do. But why don't people act? Well, most of them, the guys that I knew, that they did act. They got out of Near East South Asia. These colonels and captains they called their assignments guys and they said, get me out of here. And the assignments guys got him out of there. And that's what they did. They saved themselves. And they had to, because people have mortgages. They have kids in college. You think somebody's 40, late 30s, early 40s. They're thinking about, if they have kids, they're thinking about paying for college. They don't really, maybe they don't want to move out of the area because their kids are in high school. There's all kinds of reasons. They have a mortgage. There's all kinds of reasons people don't want to sacrifice their career. And most of them, and these 2 guys are not, my 2 friends that got out of the job, got new assignments. Both of them, I believe, went to work for defense organizations after they retired. They want that second career, which you're not going to get if you're a whistleblower. So, it's just people look out for themselves and they don't take the action. But many, many people saw what I saw, and many, many people were as upset as I was. It's just they didn't act as I did because of, I think in many cases, they have to take care of their families or themselves, and people don't like criticized. I mean, I remember when I did go public after I retired and I started writing about this stuff. Rumsfeld's like, oh, she's a disgruntled employee. Well, thank God I was a woman, because if I hadn't have been, he would have said worse stuff about me. He couldn't call me a son of a bitch. But you get criticized, and people think that women don't want to be criticized. Frankly, I don't think anybody does, and a lot of guys are more sensitive to it than women are. So, and I think you see a lot of women in whistleblower roles because they don't really care. They don't care if men criticize. Not all women, obviously, but some. And but anyway, yeah, a lot of people saw what I saw, were as cynical as I was, understood what was happening, this propagandized make war, this harnessing of our military might and power, which is formidable, for basically nothing more than a private agenda. Pretty bad stuff. A lot of people saw it, but not everybody could act. And if they did act, most of the time they acted to just remove themselves from this position and let it go, not talk about it, put it behind them, move on.
Well, Karen, it's interesting. Every time that that we interview, a whistleblower, a dissenter. Well, first of all, it's funny that you said that there's a lot of women, because there are, right? It's a real thing. I mean, if you look at, EMN, we've got, you and Colleen, and I started to think, wow, okay, there's something to that I hadn't really thought about. But every time we interview, someone fitting that mold, I find that the personality type that does it, despite the fact that much of the criticism leveled always seems to be in the vein of, either they're like disgruntled and they're just like perennially angry people, or that they like want their 15 minutes of fame and they're just trying to make a name for themselves. That's the critique. And then yet, whenever we talk to these people, whenever I've gotten to know them, all of you tend to, if anything, tack in the direction of, oh, I didn't do enough, I wasn't quite a whistleblower. There's a humility to it that I always notice, which is striking in a way.
I have felt, and I've said this before, and way too late, of course, but I wished that in my last 8 months in the Pentagon, I had collected documents, classified documents, and either made copies or somehow secured them. I wish that I had done that. I think it would have helped. It would have helped people be convinced, because it took years. The movie Why We Fight, I think that was 2004. Really, it wasn't until 2008 and 2009 where people began to look back and say, hey, this was a neocon war. What did we do here? That we were lied to. This didn't happen. We were told it happened and it didn't. We were taken to war under false premises, really. So, that's. But I didn't do those things, and I think also a lot of people who serve the government, and probably people who serve businesses too. I mean, people have ethics, and they thou shalt not steal. You think of it, and you think, well, I'll do what I can but I still have to do the right thing, and actually doing the right thing is what drives almost. Better than I do, because you've talked to more people, but I think they feel like they have to do the right thing, and then obviously to really do it right, we would have needed to do like how our NSA guy in, what's his face? The one that we need to get a pardon for in Russia.
Oh, Snowden. Yeah.
What Snowden did, and actually provide the evidence so that other people can objectively view and look at it. And so you can ask questions to provide that transparency. Just like Assange. I mean, Assange created a way of holding governments and institutions accountable, forcing transparency. This is a great thing. We need to do that. And so after the fact, you always wish there was more transparency, because really, and we do this in all of our wars, and I'm sure all countries do this if they have wars. We count our dead. We don't count the other side's dead. We count the damage that we've done to other countries. I mean, we didn't in Vietnam. I'm sure we didn't care in Korea. We don't care in all of our interventions. And in Iraq, where they still don't have, and this is strange to me, but they don't have the potable water systems and the healthcare and anything else that the economy, the level of the economy, they don't have any of that to the level that they had under Saddam Hussein. So they still haven't even gotten to where they were in 2003.
The guys and I love doing the podcast. Being able to share our experiences in the military with allies and supporters means the world to us. But we can't do all the work. We need you to share an episode of ours with someone, anyone whom you might think would be affected by it. Young people looking to join the military, or parents advocating for one, conscientious citizens who care about the violence the U.S. wages in their name, advocates for women and people of color who understand the harsh environment the military creates for minorities and inflicts on minorities across the globe, and anyone else you think it might affect. Please take a moment and share this with them. Our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters, helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out our honorary producers, and they are Will Arens, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Emma P., Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Jason, Zach H., Ren Jacob, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our awesome store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
That's our legacy, but we don't count that. And of course, the refugees and the displaced people and the deaths and the shortened lifespans of other people that aren't quite dead, but they're not going to live a full life because of, the war. We don't count any of that, and it's kind of not right. Americans, we think we are very fortunate to live in this country, and we have this sense of that we're good people, that we do good things, that we care for the world. But really, it's not good that we do. Certainly, letting the military run rampant, being willing to believe lies if it makes us feel certainly a little bit patriotic, or if we're fearful, and it's when people are scared. Authority figures gain power, and those authority figures, we think, well, they must be good because they're an authority. No, not at all. They're probably criminals, and we should be very cautious about believing a lot of what our governments tell us, especially in times of crisis, in times of fear or whatever. We have a track record. Even if you don't believe it philosophically, and you say, well, this is natural for these institutions, you could look historically and say, well, in the past, when we've had crises, did our government lie to us? And it's like, well, yeah, every single time. So you can learn from history a little bit, and we need to be far more critical and distrustful of our government. Now, I'm not even talking about who's in charge. I don't care who's in charge. It didn't matter in Iraq. I think Obama prosecuted Iraq pretty darn enthusiastically after Bush had done it. In fact, in Afghanistan, what's that, 17 years? And I think Trump's trying to bring the troops home from Afghanistan, but he won't be able to do that. I don't know if you looked at the NDAA that they're trying to sign, and he threatened he was going to veto it. The most recent. Mm-hmm. And he threatened to veto it because he's unhappy with Facebook and Google and whatnot. And he wants Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, that allows them not to be accountable for the things that are posted, whatever. So he says, well, you need to do something about them. They talk bad about me. So he says, so I'm going to veto it because you didn't do anything about Section 230. In fact, the NDAA stops the troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, Iraq, and maybe even Syria. Stops it. This is Trump's order, but he's not gonna veto it for that reason. So and maybe he doesn't know that, but he should know. If I know it, he should know it. So, it's out there. You can read it. I think, Danny, I know antiwar.com published it. So,
yeah,
it's out there. It's factual. And so there is no intention of the institution to correct its mistakes. There's no intention of the institution to look at reality. The institution that are involved in our foreign policy, these institutions do not share the average American's perspective. They don't share the average American's sense of decency or common sense. They don't share it. They live in a different world. So, yeah. And that's what I just said there. Maybe I'm maybe there's some tension in my voice, some anger. Well, that's how I felt 20 years ago. Same way, same exact way, same stuff that keeps happening. And we, the people, buy into it over and over again.
And seem to never realize that all of the obscenity you're describing is in fact done in our name. Whether or not we have a draft, whether or not there's a war tax directly, it doesn't change the fact that those Yemeni children, those Iraqi casualties and refugees, that's in our name. I mean, that was bin Laden's argument, flawed but not completely irrational as to why one could attack the United States citizenry. Now, I don't agree with that, the way he derived that, but at the same time, in a ostensible democracy, right?
And even in the stuff that Israel does to the Palestinians, oftentimes with American munitions, which made in the USA on the so we put our stamp even on those things, which most Americans are not supportive of, and feel bad about. But we're going to get blamed for it, and we are responsible for it because we elect people and we say, you just go do your thing, and we trust them when we should never trust them. And I'll tell you, this is kind of a present day thing, but you take Trump, right? 4 years of Trump, and Trump's been great to watch. I mean, it's just tons of fun, right? Trump derangement syndrome is a real thing. And people are very unhappy. Some people are very fearful and unhappy. Trump's destroying the planet or whatever he's doing. But one thing Trump has helped do, and Biden also, which is such a beautiful thing, the senile Biden, the guy who can't put two sentences together that make any sense. This is wonderful because first we have Trump, who apparently wakes up in the morning, starts tweeting whatever's, comes to mind. People don't respect that. They don't think that he's a wise man. And Biden, they might like Biden as a person, but the guy's senile and something is going on in his brain that prevents him from communicating effectively. And so we accept that. We go, well, you can't communicate very well. And, we hope he'll be okay. Maybe the people around him will make sure. But we have given every opportunity to see incompetence in action at the highest level. And yet we still, we think, oh, well, but yeah, they can take us to war. My God, of course they can't take us to war. I wouldn't have these people drive my kid to school. It's a good thing. We're learning. I think as a society, we are learning. I think Americans are becoming aware that we are badly led. And if that's the case, if we accept that, and it doesn't matter who we elect, we're badly led. So then we say, well, who are the, what keeps things going? Who are these members of these institutions? And, it's just like this guy they're nominating for Secretary of Defense. Biden has named a guy, the guy I'm talking about, Army General. He'll be the first Black.
Austin, right? Lloyd Austin.
Right. So I'm reading an article about him because I don't know who's in the Army, and I read an article about him, and they said, well, one issue that will come, not the issue of the waiver on he just served and now he's gonna, there's a waiver. They gave Mattis that waiver, and they said, well, they'll probably give it to this guy. But they said at the very end, they said, well, he's part of a big capital investing group that invests in defense stuff, along with another well-known retread. So, their interests are not our interests. Their interests are, how do I fill out my portfolio from my position? And that's not something Americans trust either. So we have incompetent leadership, and then we have corrupt institutions. So that ought to be helping us to be, as a people, a little more cynical about every little war they want to go to. Not sure that's happening, although Trump has, I think one of his things that he said is that he did, and I think it may stand the test of time, is he didn't engage in any new military interventions in 4 years. Now, if you hate Trump, you can say, well, that's because he couldn't work with the institutions. Well, I don't care why it was. I will take that. But we'll see what Biden does. Biden's already talking about, we got to get back to interventions, so we can prove what a great, powerful country we are. But again, I'm 60. I'm 60 years old. I feel like I'm like 20, and I look at the world and I go, wow, what's going to happen next, right? But the U.S. position on the planet is not what it was when I was 20. It's not what it was when I was born. It's very different. we are, if we're out trying to prove how great we are, we need to maybe find a new way to do that, because it's not going to be done militarily. We haven't, it's just not. We have spending on defense projects, which put money into every congressional district, employ a great many people, and fund a great many lobbyists. So we do that. But, the future is not going to be, we're going to get back to the way it was in the, after World War II, when we were the last man standing. It's not going to be like that. It's not like that now. Has been like that for some time. And a lot of these politicians who, I guess they're appealing for votes on the, American greatness, military greatness in particular. That's another one of those lies that the people are being told. That is unachievable at this point. It's something that we are an empire, not a republic anymore. I think the past number of elections have shown that you cannot get 300,000 people and call a vote and call it a democracy. That's not a republic. We're not a republic, and we are an empire, but we're an empire in our final stages. We're in an empire where the forces are really pulling us apart, and it's not a bad thing. It's going to be a painful thing, but it's not a bad thing. Anyway, that's just my opinion. But I think Biden will be a part of this, because he's very much like Trump in the sense that no one trusts him to be a wise decision maker. Now, the Democrats are saying they do, but I don't think really they do either. We're not sure what he will wake up and say.
Well, absolutely. And it's interesting how terms like empire are getting more of a hearing now than they did 12 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when it's related to the United States. And a lot of empires they go to die in Afghanistan, of course, but they often, behave badly in Africa as well. And it's been interesting over my, most of my military career, but especially after, kind of the way I've connected with some of you, voices who were dissenting even before we met, right? This is really the first time we've spoken at any length, besides over email and stuff like that, and haven't met. And that's the case with many people. But this week I had released a piece at Tom Dispatch with Bill Astori, who's been writing there for a long time, also retired Air Force, who started speaking out after he retired. And we wrote these kind of fictional letters back and forth, like pen pals, about, imagine if we had started speaking when I was still in uniform, because he retired in 2005, which was the year I commissioned out of the academy. And it reminded me of some of those years. And you mentioned that sense of anger that really hasn't fully left you. And I know it's there for me. And in those years that we were going back and doing this pen paling, I was pretty angry. And, I first ran into you and Larry Wilkerson in the Why We Fight documentary, which, as I mentioned, I watched it, and then I watched it again, and then I watched it again, all within like a 2-week span in early 2008. So I had just come back from the 15 months, which really spanned the first year of the Iraq surge. We had been extended, and then actually had begun just before the surge. I had gotten there in October, and I had come back and really was not in an okay place. And I know that other folks probably had it worse, and I don't mean to overplay that, but I was in a rough spot. I was very angry. I couldn't understand what I had just been asked to do. And, I felt really helpless about what I could do about it. And then I watched this documentary, and I don't even really remember how it came into my world, but I watched it, and I watched you speaking out in particular, because you had only recently been in uniform, and then listening to Larry Wilkerson speak. And I just thought to myself, oh, okay, I'm not completely alone. In fact, there are these people, I was first lieutenant. There are these people who are senior to me by a whole lot who came to a lot of the same conclusions, and maybe there are others. It was like that sense of you're an alien, and then you find out, oh, there's others in the species. And then over the years, I had followed some of your work, so I was familiar with you. And when Colleen said, hey, you should think about Karen. And this past year, I go in and out of these scholarly diversions that are pretty intense for a layperson. And I'd been writing a lot about kind of sub-Saharan Africa and had been studying Angola in particular and the Portuguese Empire and looking for parallels there and just the way they were sort of the last empire and then what had happened after with the Cubans and Reagan. And sure enough, that was when I think I first realized, because I had seen you cited in your academic work, I had seen you cited in some other stuff I was reading, and then your name jumped out, and it's not a common name. And I was like, oh my goodness, she studied Africa. And so that was just one of those weird moments in life, right? So it connects, 15 years apart or 13 years apart. And I had to ask you, and I think I mentioned this in my initial email to you, why was it in the early 80s, and then after, that you got interested in the topic of Africa, particularly Southern Africa, right, which isn't usually at the forefront of American policymaking, particularly in the more modern era where it's all about the Middle East and North Africa. So how did you get interested, and did and if so, how it kind of inform any of your views about American policymaking moving forward, and then of course today, right, with AFRICOM and all the madness on the continent?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't. I am a zoology major. That was my undergraduate degree, zoology. So, in a sense, as a young person, always, Africa is a huge, just a frontier. So there's that kind of thing. Like Alaska is a frontier. It's these places that are big and that are unexplored in many ways, or at least from a Western perspective, unexplored. So there's that. But the military, when I was made, my job was the first job I had in the air staff. I was looking over the sub-Saharan Africa portion of air operations. And there wasn't much then at that time in the late 90s really going on other than the ACRI, which I wrote a book that they published down at the air, what was it? One of the air places published, Air Force Institute or something. But that study, and actually, I'll tell you this, wasn't so much I was interested in Africa, but when you work for government jobs and you're curious about stuff, a lot of times your jobs aren't that interesting. And I was taking classes at night because my PhD, I had all my classes done by the time I retired, and I was all but dissertation when I retired. So I'm looking at things from an academic perspective, like you do, in a lot of ways. And so I was I needed to learn my job, but I'm looking at it from a historical and academic perspective as much as I am just what do I need to do my job. And that's what led to those two books, looking at kind of air operations in Africa. And of course, critiquing the African Crisis Response Initiative, which was the only thing we were really doing in Africa in the 90s. Now, big picture wise, yeah. I mean, we know that we were in bed with South Africa, the nuclear situation, all kinds of stuff. We were resource dipping U.S. companies, and the U.S. was interested in Africa for that. But the African Crisis Response Initiative training program was kind of a small little thing, and I wanted to see if it was working. And a lot of these things, because I traveled there and seen some of this stuff, and I was like, well, is this really effective? I don't know. So we did I wanted to put together the numbers and see if it was effective. And very only partially effective at anything. But I kind of learned, and the more I learned, the more interested I got. So the Air Force kind of led me to being interested in Africa. But the other thing was, we didn't, at the time that I was at the Air Staff, we did not have any AFRICOM, and it wasn't really being discussed. By the time I moved up to the Office of, the Sub-Saharan African Affairs stuff in OSD, they were trying to get AFRICOM set up, and they did. At the very end of my term there, they were able to put an office there in Stuttgart, which is where EUCOM, the European Command, is located, and they created a on paper office, and they staffed it with some people and said, you're AFRICOM, and they were dealing with various countries on the continent there to see where we would put a physical headquarters. And of course, this is the other cynical part. Back in the 80s, one of the jobs I had up in Hanscom was acquisition. And we weren't buying things for foreign countries or selling things to foreign countries, but we were wasting a lot of money. And so I became aware of how some of that works. And then when I worked with in the air staff and at OSD, you see how much money is thrown around and the kind of deals that are done the trading that's done, the arms sales type issues. In fact, a lot of what we wrote about in NISA had to do with who are we selling arms to? Who are we funding the sales of arms to? How do we get friends to buy our stuff and not buy other people's stuff? It's similar to the way the Cold War operated. We wanted to sell our stuff so they wouldn't buy Soviet stuff. And but that didn't change at all after the Cold War ended. It was just more, how do we sell our arms and how do we create these so-called allies? But we do it with money. We give them money. I mean, and I have never been to Afghanistan, but or Iraq. But you hear there's even movies now that talk about bales and pallets full of dollars straight out of the treasury. We buy in and nobody ever sees them again. But that's how we do our foreign policy. We buy it, and so some of that I saw in Africa to a great extent, and also I studied Africa economic type issues and agricultural type issues, and of course their history of colonialism. You look at how these things work, and it's very interesting because they've got most of the countries, not all, and it does depend on who colonized them and what European models were forced on top of what they already had and how that melded together. But most of these countries have a wealthy class. I guess they're starting to look like the U.S. They have a very wealthy class that controls policy. And then they have a bunch of other people that is working their butts off trying to make ends meet and not being very wealthy. And so you see that and you think about, well, where do we play? And, how does the U.S. military impact that? Well, we don't. If anything, we're making the rich richer. That's our tool. We go to the guy in control and we buy him. At least it appeared to me that that's how we did it. That was the fundamental of how we influenced other countries. And then, of course, I also said, well, how do other countries do it? Because the Soviet Union had collapsed by then, and Russia was not as interested in, they were interested in selling things, but certainly not as as an empire, because their empire had collapsed. But what was the other big players on the African continent, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, was China. And how did they do it? Well, they didn't sell arms. They built factories to kind of help people. They did capitalism, which is kind of interesting because the commies are doing capitalism, which is actually, creating a higher quality of living for more people in a lot of these countries. And yes, I'm sure they didn't work in the best environments, but at least they were moving up in the world a little bit, or they felt that they were. And that's what China brought. China brought trade, production, and that kind of thing. They didn't sell too many arms while we were busy selling arms. And again, our African Crisis Response Initiative had to do with arms and working with American teams, eventually combat teams, to do what? Well, not clear. Maybe we picked an enemy and went and got him. I don't know. I mean, there's some weird stuff going on in Africa after I left that I do not understand. And you remember in, what was it? In Niger, I think it was, where we lost some special forces people.
That's right. Yeah. Four soldiers in 2017.
Yeah. This was long after I left, but you have to wonder, are we being, the way our U.S. military policy in Africa is, are we perceived as taking sides? Yes. Are we perceived as an enemy by many? Yes. And are we perceived as vulnerable? And the answer have to be yes on that too. So we're not doing real well with that. Now, you don't hear about, Chinese factories being blown up. I'm sure that they probably are some that are blown up from time to time, but you don't hear a lot about that. So just a different approach. The American, and again, this is not the American people's foreign policy. What you and I are talking about here with sub-Saharan Africa, most Americans don't have the slightest interest or clue that we're even in Africa. And AFRICOM, they don't understand what is AFRICOM. It is logical, of course, that they would put it in Djibouti because, we own that whole little plot of land. I guess it's all bases, all U.S. bases, or maybe a tiny bit of French base left, but mostly U.S. And so we put our headquarters there. But what really is that? That's an operational outpost for buying off leaders. I can't see what else it does. It's really an awful thing too, because in this country, in the past year, we've heard a lot about Black Lives Matter. Well, not in Africa, they don't. not to us, apparently. I mean, I would love to see the BLM people who are rightfully angry and activated. This is a good thing. They should take a look at U.S. policy in Africa, because I don't think they would support it. And I certainly don't support it. Most Americans, if they found out what we were doing, would not support it. And again, the institution is run wild. It is, which is why I love Julian Assange and Snowden and these folks that are trying to help keep democracies and republics, self-governed states, to keep them honest to the people that pay for their existence. Because most Americans have no clue as to what the Pentagon does and where it does it.
Well, I like to say provocative things. Some people think just to be indulgent, which is probably a little true, but I also think there's value in it. I often say that, AFRICOM has nothing to do with Africans when I'm describing that subject. And I think that there's demonstrable proof that that's the case. I mean, none of the outcomes of, having this AFRICOM headquarters, putting an emphasis there, sending all these advisors in since 2008 when they opened the new command, the outcomes have been really awful. And I've also been provocative and gotten myself in trouble saying, after I spent a month every day in the streets, just in solidarity, obviously not trying to be a leader in the sort of post George Floyd protest, I said a few times, and it angered people. I sure hope, that some of the people that, tens of millions who mobilized in the streets rightfully, I hope they'll be there when there's time for solidarity for an anti-war movement or, anti-interventionism or all these things. And hopefully seeing this police militarization will shake something loose about the connections between foreign and domestic policy, but also on this idea of, if the lives of people of color matter, then that maybe should transcend borders, because it's clear that that's not been the motive or the outcome of U.S. policy, right, in Africa.
That's true. And I don't think it's too much to ask either, that people do make the connection. They should make the connection between our foreign policy for 50, 60 years now, our interventions abroad, and the militarization of our police forces at home and the way they behave. Because there's a lot of people getting shot because SWAT teams are coming in shooting them. Now, why are they doing that? That's not policing. That's military stuff. But why are they doing military stuff? Because, this is a planned, profitable, institutionally driven shift in how our country has domestic security. It is to militarize it. And again, if you study, and I know you guys do, study the history of empires, this is something that happens. Freedom is lost as domestic freedom is increasingly constrained and lost, and people are treated more and more like foreigners in their own country. And, I think to some extent, Black Lives Matter movement has made people aware of this. And it is people of color, but it's also an overall system where the fundamental American, just the regular working class American person, it's almost like class warfare. There's Americans who work and produce and live their lives, and they're often treated badly by their own government. And we're treated like, it's almost like our country is being occupied by these institutions. And I hope I'm alive, and I expect to be when we see this really change, because I do think we're due for a major change. And whether that comes from a populist revolt or a peaceful decentralization of power, even secession of states and regions from the Pentagon, from these institutions that control our country and try to control the world. I think that's going to happen. I do think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And I'm planning on being alive to watch it and help.
Hopefully it helps that you feel 20 because, first, 60 is not very old any longer. And feeling 20 helps.
I see it happening. There is an education problem in this country, though, that public education is part of how we're controlled, I think, and it's not very good. We don't we're talking here about, my career maybe starting in 83. So 20 years plus 17. So we're talking about a 40-year span of time. And we've mentioned presidents' names. We've mentioned political crises. We've mentioned interventions, right? That we all are familiar with because we study it. But this is not what people learn, in school. They don't learn much in school, and they certainly don't learn that. So a lot of folks, a lot of activists are really not, they don't have the information to really make the connections that they need to make, that they should make. And their frustration level is high. The BLM movement, other popular movements, and you can take ones on the right too, like the Second Amendment movement, right? This is a bunch of people that don't take my guns, right? Don't take my guns. And I have a Second Amendment right, whatever. And they're very angry. But then you talk about one step, advanced or making connections between this. Those connections aren't being made. They do not. They blame a president, like Biden's going to take our guns, but Trump wouldn't, and they're missing the point because Trump would, and presidents before him. I mean, it's the way power is organized in this country. We think it's, they keep talking about, it's what the people want. We have elections, we're a democracy, or even that we're a representative republic. They may say that, but they're not believing what their own eyes are telling them. They're hearing stuff and catchphrases. They're angry about things, but they're missing a cognitive or experiential type connection that will allow them to say, hey, what the real problem is you can't have a republic with 300 million people in 4 time zones. You can't do that. Or you can't have an empire. You can't call an empire a republic and think, and have a set of expectations of what a republic would do, when in fact we're not a republic, we're an empire. And but they don't study these things, they don't learn these things, so they get very angry, but they're not sure quite what to do about it. And this is a problem. This is a problem because scared people, frustrated people are vulnerable to authoritarian systems. And I am very much even though I spent 20 years in the military, I'm very anti-authoritarian political systems. I oppose them. I mean, my concern, my problem with communism isn't communism. It's that it's an authoritarian, centralized control power. That's my problem with it. So,
Absolutely. So, we've taken up a bunch of your time, but I do want to make one last pivot, if that's okay, to, so first of all, I think the whole aspect of education and where people are at on these issues and how in many cases we and people, other folks who even disagree with us who are engaged with these issues, we end up talking past the American people. I think that's important because, and it's not meant to be patronizing, it's just a fact. So, you wrote about Angola. I've written some about Angola. I thought it was super clever when I made an article titled, Cosby or Castro, who had more of an influence ending apartheid. And I was so proud of that and did all this research. And then at the end of it, I was glad I did it. But I thought, would my mom understand what I'm writing here? And like, that's like my litmus test. And of course, the answer is no. In many ways, I'm like writing way just past what people even care about. But at the same time, you mentioned anti-authoritarianism, which I fully agree with. It's why I like, Simone Weil and Camus, and they were hated by the left of their time because they criticized authoritarian communism, which was kind of in vogue and, in the philosophical left. But, you did run for Congress, right? I mean, you got involved in electoral politics briefly, which I think is super interesting on a number of levels. It's something I'm asked about a million times. And I think probably most of us who are active politically at all or as public voices are always asked, are you going to run for something or all this? And I wanted to know what made you run and what that experience was like. What was your experience in the electoral arena and what did you kind of take from it?
Well, I'm in a Republican congressional district, heavily Republican. So and I'm conservative, I guess, conservative libertarian or whatever, but I went against an incumbent who, I think he was running for his 11th or 12th term at that time, Bob Goodlatte. And I used to vote for Bob, but I farm. After I got out of the military, we live out here and I farm, small farm, but raise cattle, and now I have sheep too. And so, I'm looking at agricultural policy and things like that. And there's a lot of authoritarian controls that come down through the USDA. And Bob was the head of the, he had been past chair of the House Agriculture Committee, that kind of thing. And so he was, he knows nothing about farms. So I was basically dissatisfied with my representation, not on a military sense, but of course, in studying Bob, I realized he also was terrible on technology and terrible on war. I mean, he was a pro-war guy. Didn't really. I don't know if he had studied these things, if he thought about them, but he was a typical, long-term congressman. He looked at what are the other guys doing and what do I need to do to keep and maintain power within the Congress. That's how he judged it. And so I challenged him basically not on those issues, which are more domestic district type of issues. And it was during the time, it was in 2012, the election of 2012, that year. And so I did get, the Tea Party was big then, and I forget where the Tea Party came from, but actually Ron Paul was bigger. Tea Party diverged from Ron Paul, but there was a lot of what you would call amongst the Republican side, kind of a libertarian-leaning populism. Again, the same stuff that probably got Trump elected 4 years ago. It's the same kind of thing. And it's interesting to see how this is not going away, this populism, this common sense, demanding accountability amongst your for your representatives. So there was that going on. So I pretty much got, like, within the party primary, I got the Tea Party vote and some of the hardcore conservative constitutional type votes, a libertarian vote. So I got basically 34%, and he wiped my, he won handily that primary. I went on. So, but what I learned about it was that there's a lot of kind of what you mentioned earlier, what we mentioned about who else is out there that thinks like you do or shares some of your perspectives and experiences. And there's a lot of them. So I did meet a lot of people who are hardcore constitutional, limited government type people that I would consider. Of course, I live in Virginia, so people that I would think are maybe the heirs to an extent of some of the founders, not so much in terms of their slavery issues, which I think is all anybody thinks about, but their ideas of a limited government, of decentralized power, their fear of centralized power, their fear of what people being flawed, what flawed people will do if they're given unlimited power, or if they're given no accountability, lots of money and no accountability. What will happen? They were scared of that. They were fearful of that. And there's a lot of people today who feel much the same way. And I got to meet a lot of those people. So that part was fun. And, so I did learn quite a bit. I think when people run, and what I would have done had I prevailed, it would have been very difficult, because as soon as you become a congressman or a woman, it is a different thing. I mean, very few people can be Thomas Massey's or Ron Paul's. Even Rand Paul is continually criticized because he compromises on different things. So I'm not sure what I would have been as a congressperson. I definitely would have been honest. I probably would have been a pain in the butt. That's worthwhile. But I think to run for office and to win a seat on the Congress or Senate, you have a platform which can be used if you're the kind of person that will use it for good things. And that's really that to me is why you would run for Congress. Yes. Do you want to represent people? Sure. But what the people want from their government is often very different than what is, than what you might want to do, because what people want is they want a redistribution of assets that have been taken from the other 434 districts, and they want that put into their district for the most part. I mean, a congressperson's job is to help lobby for, federal and state money to flow into your district to create jobs and whatever those jobs are. And this, again, was something that the movie Why We Fight made very clear. You have a lot of people who don't like war at all, but they have worked their entire lives in munitions factories. Well, that's the job that I had. That's the job that was in my area. That was the best job I could get. And I enjoyed the work, but they don't make the connection. But so we have and this is what Eisenhower talked about, the military industrial congressional complex. It's very hard to beat that. And it's in place, it's powerful, and it really works a number, on the people, on the average person, until that person has to lose their child or their spouse, or a relative or a friend. They don't really realize the cost of it. It seems like it's all good, right? It's all good. We're making munitions. We're doing all this stuff. They want to believe good things about what they're doing, and we're all responsible. We all have a little bit of responsibility to not be a part of it. Again, decentralization starts with each of us, right? I mean, and we're all doing it. We're all saying, I'm not taking my talking points from, from the Pentagon. I'm not taking them from the neoconservative warmongers. I'm not taking them from the left-wing humanitarian warmongers. I reject that. So here's what I'm doing. I'm decentralizing from that. But it's going to be an uphill battle unless some kind of crazy crisis happens. But it's hard to say, because usually during the crises, that's when people look to the authoritarians. I mean, even you can take COVID, right? I mean, the governors became dictators, and they were for the most part. Yes, you hear complaints, but for the most part, people welcomed it. That was strong leadership, and they said, "Well, I'm scared. Protect me, Mr. Governor. Tell me what to do." It's almost a human failing or a weakness, something we need to try to help our kids grow out of and help ourselves grow out of it. A hard problem. There's a lot of hard problems here.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And we see that authoritarian instinct in fear, for sure. And COVID to me is just another exposure of that. And so much of what you referenced about the role of the congressperson is interesting to me. I respect that you took that dive, that you attempted that. And Colleen did too, right? Colleen ran up in Minnesota, I believe, at one time. And it's clearly a tough road. And yet you think to yourself, if we all just kind of, completely reject electoral politics, there's problems with that too. Although there are my moments where I definitely have the Plato guilty pleasure of the sort of philosopher king being the best option, but I don't really believe that. It's just that feeling when things seem so dark.
Have many small kingdoms, then it would probably be very good. We need more. Maybe we need a lot more philosopher kings than we're
right. Well, neither Trump nor Biden really fits the mold now, do they?
And this is, we have to, we're all along for the ride, but it's interesting to see the quality of our presidents really going downhill. I think this helps people understand. I mean, it helps them become less knee-jerk authoritarian, because I can tell you, we know this from the past 4 years of Trump. The Democrats I shouldn't say the Democrats. Obviously, many Democrats probably voted for him, but the left was upset, and they said, well, he's not our president. He's not our person, and we don't do what he says. Great. I love that. I love that about Trump derangement syndrome, because that's the one thing they should hang on to. And then you've got, with this most recent election, all the people that supported Trump are in, not all of them, but a lot of them are saying, hey, well, Biden, I won't take an order from Biden. I love that. We shouldn't be taking any orders from these people, any of them. And we certainly shouldn't be taking them from generals. We shouldn't be taking them from an institution like the Pentagon or the CIA. And it's not clear the influence that the CIA has over a lot of things that we think. But it's not. No one appointed them the boss of how we, what we believe. So all these little things are working towards a better end in some respects. But I am a little worried about if Biden is true to what he's hinting at. And again, not because he may want to or not want to. I'm not sure what's going on in his brain, but a lot of his backers are neoconservative. A lot of the people he's bringing back into government, just as Trump did, are neoconservatives. They're embedded in a lot of places. And I certainly don't want to see the U.S. engage in more interventions or certainly wars, and yet just even this morning, I'm listening to a constant chatter on some of these conservative talk shows. We've got to get China. China's acting like the South China Sea is theirs, like kind of like the Gulf of Mexico. Sorry, right?
As if it doesn't have the word China in it.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, it's such an important point. And so I guess if I could sort of bring it home in a way, I'm always interested in the combination of professional and personal and backstory and all that. So, you did a career in the military, and then you did kind of dissent and whistleblowing to some extent, and you've won the Sam Adams Award. You've had this whole other career, writing and speaking and appearing, in different phases, particularly with a lot of attention on you immediately after the Iraq War, just like there was a whole lot of attention on Colleen for kind of what she always describes as her 15 minutes of fame, which I think was a little longer than 15 minutes. But, I guess my last question is, it's 2020. We're now in our fourth war on terror administration. You've had these various careers and tried different things, including kind of an electoral jaunt. And, what is life after whistleblowing, life after dissent like, and what's kind of next for you, I guess? What role do you see for yourself and people like you now after all of that?
Well, I don't really sit and think about the future as much in those terms, but I'm here. I'm like I said, I feel like I'm kind of 20. I feel like I'm looking ahead, and many things are possible. And I like the big picture, like a lot of us academics do. We like to look at the big picture. So my big picture would be like North America, United States. What our system? What's ahead for us? And I think it's going to be exciting, but also a little bit dangerous. And I'll tell you this, I live in the country. I grow a big garden. I can food. I have a freezer full of beef that I grew. I am kind of like a homesteader in some ways. I have a lot of skills that I've developed since I left the Pentagon. They're not great skills. I'm not teaching these skills, but I have a lot of survival skills that I didn't have when I lived in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. So, one thing that I think that trend is going to continue, and I think people are looking at what would a financial collapse in this country look like? What would sudden increased authoritarianism in this country look like? What forms would it take? And people are starting to ask themselves, what would I do? Rather than just what am I going to be told to do, but actually thinking, what will I do? That's why I love populism and protests and stuff. Yeah, it's not always good, and many people aren't well informed, and oftentimes a great deal of anger and stress and angst, and that's not happy times. But they're practicing their own agency. What will I do when push comes to shove? So I'm hoping to help in my people that I know, and maybe if I'm not writing as much as I really should be, I'm going to increase that, I think. But I hope that in my writing that I can help people feel like they have more power and more agency than they may think that they do. We're already seeing a lot of things change in our society, like college, right? It used to be college. You had to go to college to make more money. Well, we know that's not true. You don't have to go to college. I have a PhD, but you don't have to go to college to make more money in this country. There's so many things that the evidence is causing us to re-examine some of our assumptions, and that's a good thing. And I want to help with that. I want to help, and maybe in some ways, kind of like I did in the Pentagon when I wrote what I was seeing. I would say, here's the evidence. What is that evidence telling us? Is it telling us what they're telling us, or is it telling us a totally different thing? And I think if we keep our eyes open, this country's in for some exciting times. If we can stay out of a foreign war, this country can I think there's some changes coming. And I think a lot of these changes will be decentralization of power and autonomy down to smaller and smaller groups. And I think people, and I would like to help people in the small sphere of influence that I have, get ready for a greater exercise of their own agency, a greater sense of autonomy, more personal power over your future. And it's a wonderful thing. And again, this is when I keep saying I feel young. This is what a young person feels like. Very often, you leave home when you leave that authoritarian family structure, right, where dad and mom always telling you what to do, and you leave home and suddenly it's on you. That's an exciting thing. It's also scary, but it's an exciting thing. And I think in many ways, the next phase for our country will depend on the actions of people who assert themselves as individuals and don't just buy into everything they're told from their elders, from the given accepted authority figures. And I hate to pick on Zuckerberg, or what is it, the guy that does Facebook.
Right. Yeah. Zuckerberg. Yep.
Yeah. They pick on him all the time. Little authoritarian figure, or Bill Gates. Pick on him because he knows everything. He wants to make the world in his image. But this is a good exercise. We should be challenging people who assume to know more about our situation and our lives and our choices than we do. We are the authorities. We own ourselves, and that, to me, is a very liberating concept. I believe it. I try to live it. And I think that will be the way to help us get through crises in the future without mass murder, because that is the other flip side of it. Mass murder can come when empires fail and collapse, and mass murder comes when authoritarianism is unchecked. We don't want that in this country. We don't want to do it overseas, and we don't want it to happen here. So, we need to create more whistleblowers. How about that?
That is always the right answer, I think. And I want to thank you so much for this conversation. It's kind of an inspiring thing for me, because I've had my darker moments at different times for different reasons. And one of the recurring ones is, is anything that I'm doing having an influence? Like, am I screaming in the dark? Is everything futile? And then I'm like, well, I'm vaguely Irish Catholic, so masochism's kind of my thing anyway, so I'll be fine. But, at the same time, I think that the people I've come in contact with over the years that were really important to me in a very kind of virtual way, as by proxy, Andrew Bacevich, yourself, Larry Wilkerson, people that I really just respected and felt like, oh, wow, there are others. I think that I had that experience, and then I just decided to be insufferable enough to write and speak about it. But there's probably a lot of others, and you don't need me to tell you that. I'm sure that you've realized that your voice had an impact, and sometimes the impact is as much, and you had an impact on a lot of people, but it's more than just about numbers. It's about impacting people who then go have an impact and all this ripple. And that's just meant a lot to me. And so being connected in, now in EMN and collaborating on some level is cool in sort of an inside baseball way for me, but also inspiring. And I hope that you're right. And I think that you might be actually about sort of the silver linings and the excitement that can come from even dark and crisis times. So hopefully Trump and the COVID response, which has just been just problematic and all this, that some of the positives that come out of it are, you mentioned how you wouldn't let the people running the government drive your kids to school. And I feel that way all the time. And I had that moment where I realized that there are no adults minding the store. I used to think that they knew something we don't, the government. There were people who were so smart. When I first realized that wasn't true, at first it was really scary. And now I think it's actually inspiring in a way, because it hopefully gets people to realize that they are the answer, right? That it's us, and it's the grassroots, and it's the people, and it's localism. And there's just a lot of positive in that. And you've been a voice for that when it wasn't easy. And I think that some of the discussion we're having today, not to blow too much smoke up your rear end, wasn't happening in 2002, 3, 4 at the same level. People weren't using words like empire. They weren't talking about rejecting the duopoly and rejecting both Republicans and Democrats. Folks like you and Colleen and Larry and so many others from that era were saying this stuff when it wasn't cool. Right, when it wasn't in vogue at all. And it's not fully in vogue yet, but it's getting there. So, thanks for that voice that you provided to so many, and for working with me on this new project and appearing on the pod. This has been super cool, and I'm just really thankful. And So this has been awesome, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Karen.
And what you guys are doing, and what a lot of people are doing, it is gratifying. So I think we're on the winning team.
The long game. We're in for the long game. We're gonna win in the long game. But this has been absolutely great. Let's continue. Come back on again. We'll talk. Maybe we'll talk just Africa or just what's going on with the Biden administration next time, and let's keep charging along together.
Absolutely. This has been a great pleasure for me and an honor too. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time, and I'm sure that your grandkids are just waiting at the door for you to go play outdoors, and I'm about to hit toddler time, so I know that struggle as well.
All right.
Okay, well, we'll talk soon. Bye.
Okay.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not